The Soviet designer of rocket and space systems, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, spent his entire life nurturing ideas about long-distance space expeditions, including to the planets of the solar system, such as Venus and Mars. Even then, experts understood that the weakest link in these grandiose projects was the human body. Korolev often asked himself whether the cosmonauts would be able to withstand a long flight, in a huge airless space, in a closed space of a spaceship. According to experts, for a flight to Mars, each astronaut needed 700 grams of food per day, 2.5 liters of drinking and 5 liters of sanitary water, and 800 grams of oxygen. The crew of 3 people required 11 tons of life-supporting cargo in the form of food, water, and equipment for the entire flight. These calculations immediately cancelled out all plans for a flight to Mars. It was obvious that for the conditions of long-distance space flights a closed-loop support system was necessary. At KB-1, together with the Zvezda plant, they built an analog of the living compartment of a heavy spacecraft, in which Dr. German Minovtsev, biologist Andrei Bashko, engineer, Boris Ulybashev were placed for a complex experiment for 365 days. This happened on November 5, 1967. The sealed room in which the experiment participants had to stay for a whole year was 6 meters long and 2 steps wide. Moreover, half of the room was occupied by scientific equipment. Doctors tried to find out how the body would react to difficult conditions and whether there was a limit to psychological overload. To do this, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the chamber was increased, and the temperature was raised to 35 degrees for several days. Participants in the experiment were selected with complete incompatibility of characters, often deliberately provoking conflict. What the situation was like inside the cell is evidenced by one of the declassified documents, which says the following. Test technician Ulybashev, who has the qualities of a leader, begins to prepare a coup inside the facility's hermitage. In collusion with test biologist Bashko, he seeks to seize power. The experiment was so secret that its participants had to tell their loved ones that they were going on a business trip to the North Pole for a whole year. All the results of this experiment were kept top secret for 40 years. In addition to scientific equipment, the experiment participants had at their disposal folding shelves for sleeping, a table, a stove, a small bathroom and an exercise machine. There was no full-fledged shower. Instead, 1 liter of water per day was provided. Water was produced from the urine of the experiment participants using a closed life support system. The same water was used for 5, soup was cooked on it and freeze-dried food was diluted. All day and night you could hear the fans working, and several video cameras monitored life inside the room around the clock. They communicated with the crew of the earthly spaceship using radio communications. For these purposes, they created a kind of small mission control center. After several months of the experiment, it turned out that the most difficult tests were not the shortage of water, not the noise of the fans, not the emergency situation created, but the conflicts between the participants in the experiment amid the struggle for leadership. Mutual verbal skirmishes often developed into open hatred and hostility. This became clearly visible in the second month of the experiment, when a real riot occurred on board the ship. Bashko and Ulybashev, having united, began to ignore the order of Commander Minovtsev, who at that time was very difficult, because he had a pregnant wife at home. And it was not clear whether or not to inform him of the birth of the child. Then the situation changed, due to the fact that Ulybashev began to lose weight, his diet was improved and a special capsule with oil was added. Now he becomes an outcast. The other 2 crew members begin to envy him and talk about the unfair decision of the organizers of the experiment. The situation inside the chamber becomes difficult. Those who observe the participants in the experiment come to the conclusion that a little more and a real brawl will begin inside the facility's enclosure. And this will mean the end and complete failure of an important experiment. Polar explorers, submariners, and astronauts have such a thing as cabin fever or expedition rabies. It is a disorder that occurs in small, isolated groups of people, which in turn leads to outbursts of aggression and violence. However, unexpectedly, one circumstance completely changes the situation inside the chamber. This became one of the important discoveries of this experiment. After the organizers tightened the conditions and introduced an emergency situation, the crew unexpectedly mobilizes and unites. The essence of the emergency was that the temperature inside the chamber was increased to 35 degrees. After which the oxygen supply was reduced, and the concentration of carbon dioxide was increased 10 times. In addition, the experiment participants were deprived of hot food and their daily water supply was reduced by half. However, unexpectedly for the organizers, the crew began to support each other. If misunderstandings arose, all three tried to discuss and resolve the issue in a calmer atmosphere. Very often, the participants in the experiment could not sleep, their heads ached from the unbearable stuffiness, and everyone was tormented by terrible thirst. With the help of equipment and medical control belts, doctors observed what changes occurred in the body of the experiment participants. The emergency conditions resulted in an increase in body temperature and a decrease in blood pressure, and everyone felt weak and very tired. In this state, the subjects had to undergo a functional test on a bicycle ergometer with a graded load. The subject, feeling unwell, sat on the simulator, and electrodes were attached to the cuff to measure blood pressure. After which he began to pedal, the load gradually increased. According to the recollections of Andrei Bashko, at that moment he felt like thousands of hammers were knocking in his head. It was dark in my eyes, my legs stopped working, and I felt very nauseous. At this time, Ulybyshev measured body temperature and monitored blood pressure. On day 121 of the experiment, one of the participants began to hallucinate. For several nights in a row, Boris Ulybyshev heard some strange steps at night, someone walking around the hermetic chamber. However, it soon became clear that the mysterious ghost was German Mnovtsev. In secret from everyone, he took painkillers. The fact is that Mnovtsev had a purulent cyst behind his ear. And if they found out about this, the experiment could be stopped. Soon Mnovtsev operated on himself. Thus, he saved the experiment from being closed. It is worth noting that many participants in the experiment were tormented by real nightmares at night. Boris Ulybyshev recalled that due to the terrible stuffiness and thirst, he often dreamed that he was in a hot desert. Even in his sleep he felt intense thirst. Starting to rake the sand, he fell down. His chest was squeezed, after which Ulybyshev woke up. In such a disturbing dream, the subject often turned over. This caused the medical control belt to unfasten and the sensors to move away from the body. Then the doctors from the command post discovered with horror that the recording of the subject's physiological parameters had stopped. Another crew member was tormented by a nightmare in which he walked along a dark corridor lined with bandaged people. When the experiment with the emergency situation was completed, a greenhouse was added to the chamber. It was a joyful event for the crew. Firstly, there was a small additional space where you could hide and take a break from the others. Secondly, it became possible to take vitamins. In addition, the participants at that time showed the first signs of scurvy. By the end of the experiment, the crew was greatly weakened, they had to learn to walk again, their blood vessels lost their elasticity due to their malnutrition. At first, the experiment participants moved using a cane. After the experiment was completed, all three participants worked at one of the scientific institutes. However, they hardly communicated with each other. This was a consequence of a huge psychological load. According to some sources, all three were planned to be given a hero of the Soviet Union. However, for some reason this did not happen. Thanks to this powerful experiment, cosmic psychology emerged. At the moment, many of the results of this experiment include recommendations for orbital crews. They help to minimize conflicts and make the life of astronauts more comfortable.